Thank you all for being here tonight. We're so pleased to be able to bring you this History Revealed program. I want to thank the Eastside Freedom Library. Peter Ratcliffe is here tonight, and the Roseville Library, Judy Woodward, is here tonight for all their support and partnership for the History Revealed series of programs, which have been going on for years now. And we're excited to be able to continue this through this year and through 2023. So I want to thank those of you who are members of the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. We rely on the support of our members to make these programs possible. And you can find out more about both of our organizations, including membership information, programming, events out at our historic site, Gibbs Farm, and much more on our website, which is up on the screen, www.rchs.com. So I'm going to share a slide real quick here. I want to thank our presenter tonight, and Peter will introduce him. But before we do that, I want to remind everybody that next week on Thursday, September 15th, we'll have a very special History Revealed program on Indigenous Peoples Day with Dr. Kate Phillips. Again, this is going to be an online Zoom program, and you can find out more about that on either of our websites. So as a reminder, please keep your microphones and cameras turned off during the presentation. You can put any questions, comments in the chat, and Peter and I will read those out. And the program is being recorded. As I mentioned, it will be up on our YouTube channel soon after the presentation. And questions, we'll have some time for people to turn on their microphones and cameras and share at the end. So the Ramsey County Historical Society would like to acknowledge the sacred Dakota land. Minnesota Mekoche, the land where the waters are so clear they reflect the clouds, is the ancestral and contemporary homeland of the Dakota people. It is also home to the Anishinaabe and other indigenous peoples. The Ramsey County Historical Society acknowledges that its sites are located on and benefit from these sacred Dakota lands. RCHS is committed to preserving our past, informing our present, and inspiring our future. Part of doing so is acknowledging the painful histories and current challenges facing the Dakota, just as we celebrate the contributions of the Dakota people and other indigenous peoples. You can find our full land acknowledgement statement on our website. Again, that's www.rchs.com. And that includes actionable ways in which RCHS pledges to honor the Dakota and the other indigenous peoples of Minnesota, Mekoche. And in addition to Kate Phillips' program coming up, we'll be having more programs on the histories of all of in our community, including indigenous peoples and immigrants. And to that end, we're very pleased to bring you tonight's program. This is part of our Making Minnesota series, which again is going to explore those untold stories, histories, and experiences of some of the many immigrant, African-American, and indigenous communities that make up Ramsey County, which is our most diverse county in Minnesota. So I'm going to turn it over to Peter Ratcliffe from the Eastside Freedom Library. And again, thank you all for being here tonight.
Thank you, Robin. And I too want to thank everyone for being here. Tonight is very special for me. I moved to Minnesota to teach at Macalester College in 1982. And Dionicio Valdes had been one of my mentors, informally showing me how one could be a scholar and an activist at the same time. And I would not have had the life and career that I had were it not for his mentorship. And I'm just so pleased to have him with us, and so pleased by the mix of people who are joining us tonight. If you're not familiar with his work and career, he taught and directed the University of Minnesota's Ph.D. program in Chicano Latino Studies for 23 years. And then moved to Michigan State University. Among his books is Al Norte, Agricultural Workers in the Great Lakes Region, Barrios Norteños, St. Paul and Midwestern Mexican Communities in the 20th Century, Mexicans in Minnesota, which was published by the Minnesota Historical Society Press, and organized agriculture and the labor movement before the United Farm Workers, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, and California. Tonight, he's going to talk about the connections between the community and the development of the Chicano Latino Studies program at the U. We want to invite you to post questions or comments in the chat. And when Dionicio is done with his presentation, we will start to throw your questions and comments at him. And hopefully we'll have a great conversation tonight. So, Dionicio, we're all yours.
Thank you, Peter, for the flattering introduction. And I didn't realize you thought so kindly of me, but I'll take it. And again, Peter has been a dear friend, and it really has been so much fun working with you. I also noticed a number of names of people and saw a couple faces of people I haven't seen for years. And please hang on, and we'll try to make contact. I know it's been a while, but I'm still the same person, and I don't think I'm out of power yet. In today's talk, I want to discuss something a little more autobiographical than I guess I've ever done. That is a discussion of the department that I was a part of for 23 years, which was only an undergraduate department. So I didn't direct that department, and let alone its graduate program, which was non-existent. But anyway, I'd like to speak quickly as much as possible so we can carry on a conversation afterwards and respond both to questions, but also to flush out a number of things. And in this talk after the introduction, I want to talk a little bit about how the department was formed in the first part. Then I'll turn a little bit to the struggle for survival in the middle of its years. And finally, very briefly, I'll talk a little bit about its functioning. Now, for people who have not been on the inside, Chicano studies and ethnic studies entails a lot of different things, and programs are not all the same. So somebody said, well, I was in Latino studies here, I was in ethnic studies there. They have, I think, three basic elements. And again, you can make that a little more complicated if you wish. But the first element is research. And research is elitist and it's cheap. And it usually goes to the universities that don't want to invest much and don't care much about a community or students. And again, you can get a few highly published scholars, hire a secretary, and you've got a research institute. The second function of Chicano studies, ethnic studies types of programs would be recruitment and retention. And that's a very important one. It's been part of most universities for a long, long time. The third part is curriculum, or as a purveyor of knowledge. And I would say that although University of Minnesota faculty and the Chicano Studies Department participated in all three parts, it was really the third part, that is curriculum and as a purveyor of knowledge, that was central and has been central to the Chicano Studies Department, really from the get-go. And that makes it a little different than a lot of others where curriculum and knowledge, recruitment, retention, and even research were a bigger part. That being the case, again, we can turn to the story of the formation of the department. And for those of you who are younger, we have to turn to what is the context. That is, how does a department like Chicano Studies form in Minnesota? It's still the only one around in the Midwest. And we can turn to the baby boom as being really very important. That is, a population and a college education, a college age population is growing very rapidly. People born in the 1940s and 1950s into the 1960s especially, and they're pushing to go to college, and the university is very receptive. It's very receptive, very interestingly, unlike now where we're having a depopulation of university enrollments in part because of the baby boom, but also because of the economy and the philosophy behind the economy going on. At the time that Chicano Studies was formed, we're still on kind of the tail end of an economic boom, which requires American-made, U.S. American-made products and U.S. and American-made knowledge. And so you'll see the earliest workers coming to Minnesota, and especially to the Twin Cities, that is, the children of the workers, of the farm workers, of the railroad workers, the packing house workers, numbers of factory workers, become the first generation of college students. And again, they're part of an ideology and they're part of a demography, which is very different than that of 2022. Now, there's also a context of the Twin Cities. It happens to be in 1970, that is at about the time that Chicano Studies is forming, the 14th largest metropolitan area in the United States. It has almost 2 million people. And it is a huge university. Depending on the way counting is taking place, it's one of the 2 or 3 largest universities in the country. And because it's urban, because it caters to an urban population, it is simultaneously elite and popular. And it tries to meet both elite needs and popular needs at the same time. Interestingly, something that again is out of character for 2022, president at the time, his name is Malcolm Moose. And a lot of people called him Bullwinkle, but he was an Eisenhower Republican. And even he referred to Minnesota, that was kind of his little moniker, the communiversity, that is a community university, and was very proud that Minnesota had the most innovative curriculum in the Big Ten, and they claimed it was one of the most innovative in the entire country. All of this served well as a background for understanding why we might have a Chicano Studies department at Minnesota. Now, still couldn't have happened without a movement. And there is a movement going on. The Chicano movement is alive and well. And the chronology of the Chicano movement in the Twin Cities, I would argue, predates the Chicano movement nationally. And it is because the Mexican population, a very poor working class, but extremely cohesive community, resides on the west side in an area called the Flats of St. Paul. And in the late 1950s, the city of St. Paul and the state of Minnesota decide to build an airport right there. It becomes Holman Airport. And the result of that is a struggle that lasts for 5 or 6 years at least. An airport is built because the politicians and the rich don't want to fly all the way from the Twin Cities or drive all the way from the Twin Cities to come to downtown or to go to the meetings at the state capitol. So they have their airport. But the struggle does allow for the moving of the barrio onto Concord Terrace, which is nearby. Again, it's still on the west side. And that coherence makes the population aware of itself. It keeps it tight, makes it possible, again, for all the festivities that go on, the Cinco de Mayo festivals that we participated in for so long. And also, when the national movement comes to the Twin Cities, they make sure they'll always go to Neighborhood House, they'll go to other activities that are part of that, as well as in the Twin Cities. And in fact, the early 60s and the mid 60s, as the national movement takes off, we find mutually nurturing activities between the local community and the national Chicano movement. And that is a very important background that you don't always see everywhere else. Now on campus, there's another part of the movement. And it is clear that struggles were going on. I would still like to point to one. The two, in my opinion, again, I was part of both of them, most significant Chicano Studies student activities and institutions that came out of the Midwest were in Detroit and in the Twin Cities. And it was because of July 1967. That is, there were uprisings that took place on the north side of Minneapolis in July of 1967, centered on Plymouth Avenue, and a bigger one in Detroit. And out of them came community struggles that made demands on the local urban university to set up a program for their students who simply were not there. Now, in Minneapolis and on campus at the time, students also demonstrated in response to that. And then in April of '68, when Martin Luther King was murdered, there were occupations of Morrill Hall and demands for curriculum, demands for a department. By the end of 1968, African American and African Studies was created as a department at the University of Minnesota, which preceded our department at the same time, and actually beginning at around the same time, 66 and 67, there were scholars and community pressuring from American Indian Studies, which had a presence again in the Twin Cities, had a presence throughout the state, set up a number of committees. And by the following year, an American Indian Studies department was created. So again, there is a favorable environment on campus for ours, the third ethnic studies department. Now, de facto, there's basically no presence of Chicanos on campus. Ray Rebal, who is a hero, and again, for those of you who remember Ray, a lot of people say things about him, some of which are accurate, many of which are not, but Ray was always there, and he was one of the 4 students that was identified in the 1969, fall 1969 undergraduate population of Chicanos who were there. So basically there's practically no presence, and it permits the university to blow Chicanos off. Now, fortunately, and I will say fortunately, there were de facto no Chicano faculty on campus, and that is unlike most of the other universities where you have a handful of Chicanos around. And for the sake of Chicano studies, for the sake of ethnic studies, those faculty were not hired to do Chicano studies, but more significantly, they do not function as a 5th column. And that is so extremely important. And in other places, I'm very familiar with it. The 5th column inside, and especially a faculty, can do untold damage. I see an old friend of mine from Wisconsin. Yes, the 5th column on the inside of faculty did a lot of damage to Chicano studies at Wisconsin, and the 5th column at Michigan State did a lot of damage there during the years I was around. But in fact, faculty from African American, African Studies, American Indian Studies, and the program in Latin American Studies, including the Spanish department, who formed a program in Latin American Studies in 1979, became very, very important faculty allies on the inside. They were better than having a useless Chicano anthropologist or anything else around. And they served us, and they served our department very well, and they became friends and allies because they had the vision and understood how important creating a curriculum would help their programs, creating a body of knowledge which was de facto pretty limited and not ideologically oriented the way it became later on, how it would help understanding knowledge in a broader sense. And those allies made it possible to do things that otherwise simply would not have happened. Now, turning to the Chicano student movement, which still is responsible for the creation of the department, just as at Detroit, it was a community. It was Latino en Marcha, which were parents, which were adults that created that. They created the department. And in the fall of 1969, a group with 4 members initially, the Latin Liberation Front, was formed. And it later on became the Chicano Latino Liberation Front. And they did the recruitment and retention that the university was not doing at the time. And they pressured for a curriculum. and they pressured for a department. Already in 1969 and 1970, they had demonstrations demanding a curriculum and demanding a department. Now, one very significant event took place in March of 1970. For those of you who have done your Chicano studies, Crusade for Justice had its Youth Liberation Conference, its first one, led by Corky Gonzalez, and a number of students went there, led by graduate student Alfredo Gonzalez, and they were refused service in restaurants along the way and realized discrimination is alive and well, and it made them harder and it made them tougher, and leading to more activities. In the fall of 1970, they had a conference to create a curriculum on campus. And finally, in the summer of 71, the department plan was created in the Summer Chicano Studies Institute. And that led to a debate in the fall of 1971 in the College of Liberal Arts Assembly, where they had a debate. And there was a massive demonstration outside in the range of 300 to 400 Chicano students and allies and friends demonstrated demanding a department. And there were 2 voice votes that voted against the department during the CLA assembly. And Roybal stood up as an observer and he said, I demand a vote that will be a roll call vote. And in the roll call vote, there was a reversal. And again, it's a very exciting debate that took place, but the Chicano Studies Department was approved by the College of Liberal Arts Assembly in the fall of 1971. And as a result, the following winter, which would have been the winter of 72, the Chicano Studies Curriculum Committee was formed, and it operated with faculty members, community, and student members, and it was headed by Russell Hamilton. Those of you who remember the Spanish department, Russell Hamilton is interesting because he was in the Spanish department. He was also in African Studies, and he was a great ally of ours as well. And after that took place, the Chicano Studies department had its first formal courses in the fall of 1972, and Alfredo Gonzalez was named the first acting chair. In the early years, things were working fairly well. A major was approved in 1975. Faculty members assisted, and especially Alfredo, as well as another of the very first faculty members, Marcela Lucero Trujillo, in creating what became the Chicano Student Cultural Center. La Raza Student Cultural Center was named later on, as well as the Chicano Latino Learning Resource Center. And they were not formally linked to Chicano Studies, but we will note later on, they became good allies of ours, and we later on worked together. So that is pretty much the story of the formation of the department. I want to briefly talk about a struggle for survival, because without that struggle, Chicano Studies would have died in the early 1980s. The first faculty members, that is Alfredo, Marcela Trujillo, and the others, especially Gilberto Lopez y Rivas, did not survive. Now, there were a handful of other faculty who were less involved, who I don't want to talk about much, but basically the story was people are hired without a PhD and they don't have a prayer in meeting the promotion tenure requirements of a major elitist university like Minnesota. So they pretty much after their first 3 years or potentially 6 years are gone. And Marcela and Alfredo were 2 of them. Gilberto Lopez y Rivas came in with a PhD. He was my predecessor. So Jimmy, you're out there somewhere. He was your predecessor too. And he was also your predecessor. But anyway, Lopez y Rivas had to leave the country because the United States does not allow political diversity the way Mexico does. And he's now an assembly member. He was a longtime faculty member at Metropolitana at Mexico City, and he's now part of the Morena party in Mexico. Now, with the collapse of the first faculty, that is running them out, there was a response that the university made. They said, well, why don't we hire some stars? We're an elite university. And two major stars were hired. One was Arturo Madrid in 1973, who quickly went to the Spanish department. The second one, Rolando Hinojosa, hired in 77. And as department chair, he wrote 3 novels in 4 years, and his wife got a law degree at Minnesota. In fact, they were isolated from the community because they wanted to teach graduate students. They did not perform administrative functions or work with students or draw students. And pretty much de facto, as a new president came in, who was C. Peter McGraw, was hostile and was boycotted by Chicano students for 6 years of his presence, up until he left in 1984. But he did set up some committees kind of to study the problem. The Chicano problem used to be the Mexican problem. And one of them in 1978-79 was called the Chambers Committee, which developed the World Studies requirement, which required all students in the College of Liberal Arts to take courses on the Third World, but they excluded the Third World peoples of the United States. And so that kind of didn't work out, but the students kept struggling. McGraw also set up a committee called the Kennedy Committee on the Chicano Studies faculty, 1980 and 81, basically intended to defend the stars. Now, by 1980, neoliberalism was working its way into the university, and it was called retrenchment and it was called cutbacks, which were part and parcel of the story of the university pretty much ever since. And they want to retrench Chicano studies. When we're already skin and bones, it's a little tough, but we hung on anyway. And among the many things that happened, again, I got hired in 1980, in the fall of 1980, in the midst of the Kennedy Committee, and found out that the department was struggling a lot more than I realized. In 1981 and 82, Chicano Studies, along with Women's Studies, which was then a very small unit, American Indian Studies and African American African Studies, made a response to the retrenchment argument, saying that although we're small, we are the units that are growing. And even if the university is going to have to downsize, we are a demographic and we're an intellectual endeavor that is the wave of the future. So pay attention to us. And they didn't much. Now, we also, and again, with the help of one other hire at the time who was there for a couple of years and worked much with the community and with Teatro, especially Tomas Vallejos, we worked on enrollments. And from the time I arrived for the next 2 years, we worked on it. We already tripled enrollments and had respectable enrollments by 1983, but things were up. And in spite of that, again, Hinojosa had left. There are no senior faculty in the department, and we did have a number of rallies. The biggest one was in October of 1982. C. Peter decided he wanted to have tea and crumpets with the Hispanic community, which was kind of an interesting thing. And so we had a big rally and kept everybody out. And C. Peter peeked through the windows and received a list of demands from representatives of the student body, demanding that we have support for the program, support for the department, and especially that they hire a chair. And ultimately, it was a very strong demonstration, and it did scare the pants off of the administration to know we would keep demonstrating, we would keep fighting, and that ultimately in that following spring, we had a search, and Guillermo Rojas was hired in the fall of 1983. And I will say clearly that that pretty much ended our struggle for survival. But also from that time on, the children of the community leaders took all of our classes. And you look at the old timers, and they came in, if they like literature, they take Guillermo's class. If they like culture, they take Santos's class or Susan's class. If they liked history, they'd either take a class from Ann or from me. And ultimately, they kept struggling, and we kept struggling too, but the students were the critical factor. And during this struggle for survival, we can say one other factor was the struggle for the cultural pluralism requirement, which showed what a joke enrollments are. And the students from 1975, basically from the end of the Chambers Committee report until 85, wanted to demand that everybody engage in understanding cultural pluralism. It really is a turn on its head from what we see now as the attack on critical race theory, which is basically an attack on studying anything that doesn't have to do with billionaires, ultimately. And that struggle for month after month, students demonstrated on the mall. People spoke. I can't tell you how many times I spoke to say hi to everybody. And the strategy really was an injury to one is an injury to all. And ultimately, it was a success. And in the following 2 years, Chicano Studies, of the 41 units in the college, had the second most cost-effective enrollments. And so they had to change the cultural pluralism requirement in order to make sure that wouldn't keep happening. But ultimately, we were able to link the Learning Resource Center and the Cultural Center, the La Raza Student Cultural Center, to become an academic beacon for the Twin Cities, where we had programs every week on any kind of event we want. We had bailes for the community. Everybody came, and Chicano Studies really was a community activity, and it was for everybody. And I think it clearly was, in my view from behind, really a wonderful experience to be part of that, and especially to have the allies who fought for the community. I promised myself I wouldn't talk for more than half an hour because I'm sure people have a lot of things to discuss, to bring up. And I think I brought about most of the things that are significant to me. So with that, I'd like to say thank you very much. And I hope we can open the floor up now. Anybody there?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
So
yeah,
I think, why don't we, Robin, why don't we let people unmute and turn on their videos so we can all see each other. We're not that large a group. And great. And invite people to raise their flesh and blood hand if they would like to ask a question or make a comment.
So before we do that, Peter, I just want to let everybody know this is still being recorded.
Yes.
If we have a problem or you'd like to share something off the recording, then we will turn the recording off whenever people feel that they would like that to happen. I don't want anybody to feel constrained because it is being recorded and it will be made public.
Okay.
It's usually safe to assume the bad guys always know what we're up to anyway. So
I'd like to ask a question, but I can't start the video. This is Linda Schloff.
Yeah.
That's
May
okay,
I
We can
Linda.
hear you. Go ahead.
Hear you. Just go ahead.
Okay. First of all, I want to tell you that I grew up on the West Side Flats with people who came late to because they were harvesting beets in North Dakota and left early to plant things in Texas. So I understand that. But I also remember watching all the cars heading to the airport, and this was during World War II. So I think, Dionicio, you got the dates wrong about when that airport was established. My biggest question was, I was a student of one of the last students, I would say, of Rudy Vicoli, you know, who taught immigration history. And after that, immigration history sort of splintered into what David Gutierrez said was, his Hispanic, Mexican studies, and Asian studies. And then Erica Lee went and she succeeded Rudy Vicoli. But have you done any connections with the Immigration History Research Center? Have you done oral histories? Have you publicized the work that you've done through the Immigration History Research Center, which has a very large following? Because I think the work you're doing is just so important. I want it to get out into the community. So,
yeah, sure.
So oral histories and connections with the Immigration History Research Center, those are my major questions.
Sure. Okay. First of all, the struggle over the Holman Airport on the flats took place in the late 1950s, and that airport was completed in 63. Now, there are other little airports around and all that, but this struggle is the one that displaced the community. So I want to say that. Now, I know Rudy quite well. I knew Erica. When I first came to Minnesota, I argued till I was blue in the face with Rudy Vicoli to say, please include Mexicans in the Immigration History Research Center.
Yeah.
He refused repeatedly. Rudy was a friend of mine. So, I didn't have any problems with him, but I kept begging him, please do it, please do it, please do it. By the time Erica came, I had left the history department. I had gotten sick of them and that kind of stuff that was going on there. And I put my tenure home into Chicano studies because I was tired of them. There are a lot of wonderful people. And again, I didn't know Erica terribly well. She was a great person. I wish she had been there before Rudy, because she wouldn't have had a problem with, she would have understood immediately. But at the time, Rudy said, we can't deal with everybody. So yeah, and I've done hundreds of oral history interviews across the Midwest. And I'm kind of working on that. And a lot of my friends, some of whom are in here and can probably help me out. I see some names up here of people who have been doing a little of that work, are carrying on the struggle, not only here in the Twin Cities, but in neighboring areas as well. So thank you for all of your comments.
Thank you.
I'm struck by the story of the Holman Field. Over here on the east side of St. Paul, we've become more aware that the government decided to destroy Swede Hollow,
right,
when it was an entirely Mexican community. And it was the same government that built Interstate 94 through the Rondo community. And I did not know until you told the story tonight about Holman Field. And so, we have a narrative about ethnic cleansing and the driving the Dakota people out of Minnesota. But we have these other, a century later, these other narratives of ethnic cleansing, right, driving Black and brown people out of the communities that they've built. Right. Yeah, and I think that we're in the middle in St. Paul of a conversation about reparations. The St. Paul City Council is discussing questions of reparations. And it's not only about what was done to African descended people during slavery, but what happened in the 1950s that were done to Black and brown communities here in St. Paul, and how do we repair that? So that's an important piece you've already added to the sense of these various measures in the 50s. Thank you.
Thank you.
Someone want to, yes, Jimmy Patino.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jimmy Patino. teach in the Department of Chicano and Latino Studies these days. And I wanted to take the opportunity to, I've never met Profe Valdes in person, so to thank you for your work, for your contribution to keeping the department alive so we can grow from here, so I could be here, right? And for your scholarship. Your scholarship is still foundational to Chicano history in Minnesota, and it's been great to share it with my students in the Chicano history classes that I teach every year. So so thank you very much for that. I will add that we have four folks in the department now. I was the only one for a moment in 2013, 2014, but again, because of this cycle of activism and community engagement that you reminded us of, this longer history of it, a more recent occupation of Moral Hall again, I believe in 2015-ish or so, led to the hiring of two folks. My colega Gabriela is here too. She's one of my colleagues in the department. And so, and we're hiring a chair this year. So we're still struggling to hire full faculty in the department, but we are doing a search this year for a full-time chair and a full professor. So, so it's great to hear this history as we begin that process. I wanted to ask you, of course, community engagement, the establishment of Chicano studies and ethnic studies was in part to make the university relevant to the communities that surround it. In the years that you studied from the 80s and while you were here, what were some examples of the department's connections with community organizations or community struggles, or how did we maybe link students to the community, and how did you practice that when you were here?
Sure. It's a big question, and I think a handful of the people who are in the crowd can elaborate on some of the things because they also participated in it. But there really are two ways to examine this, okay? One is faculty who are on basic organizations. Many of us, myself, I was on a number of organizations over time. We also sent students to a lot of the community organizations. Some of the people who are heads of like clues and things like that, those are mostly our graduates, okay? A second area is that the university itself sponsored events. And I think the best example really is the La Raza Student Cultural Center. We had so many events, bailes, we had talks, we hosted probably 40 or 50 events per year. Gilberto Vasquez was heading that for many years. Unfortunately, I understand he passed away quite recently. But if you look at the list of the things that we did, which were community-based, it was just nonstop. And constantly, the purpose of it is, again, to provide what educational needs exist, and we fulfill them to the best of our abilities. And again, for much of that time, again, your faculty is a little bigger than ours, but in terms of having full-time faculty, for most of the, from 83 really up until it then is hired in women's studies, there really are only two faculty around. It's Guillermo and myself. But we're all over the place to the degree that we can be, but so many things happen, like we can say partly spinning from us, and Ann Winkler, I think, is in the crowd, can speak a little bit about the activity she worked on, especially regarding Central America, the research center, and many of the things that happened with them and with our allies. But there really is just, it's overwhelming, I guess, when I look in retrospect at the things that we were just doing nonstop with that. And the links ultimately become established permanently when our students go in and become part of pretty much every organization, every Chicano, Latino ethnic organization, and so many of the other community organizations that are around. So anyway, yeah, that's a fine question, and it's a big and complicated answer, some of which is quite difficult to measure, I must say. Thank you, Jimmy.
Gracias.
Anne, do you want to add anything to that?
I was just thinking the university ironically helped keep that connection by trying to destroy the department constantly, and having to call the community in to actually kept that relationship very much alive. It was like a constant reminder that that this is a department that does only exist because of community, because we needed the community to come and act as as protection for the department.
Thank you. Yes, Susan Green, please.
I'll ask Dennis a question, one that I know he's going to like. Can you talk about the role that Minnesota Nice played and discourses of civility in any academic institution? How the story I heard about going to the president's tea and crumpets was about a bunch of Chicanos and raggedy vans, and it was about the displacement of respectability and the displacement of civility as a narrative in Minnesota Nice. So you want to talk about kind of the particular politics of why the Chicano Studies Department develops the way it does in Minnesota in particular?
Sure. I don't know. I think we were always very nice. We weren't, we were civil to everybody. One of the problems is, how do you deal with the big lie? And that's a difficult matter. That is, when people just repeatedly are telling you incredible things that you cannot with a straight face accept, you go, I'll smile and nicely say, okay, that's the way it goes. But it's not really nice of you to talk that way. What can I say? But again, the students at the University of Minnesota, and the Chicano students in particular, as a demographic, do represent, if you're going to cut across, much more of a working class population. That is, students who are first generation college, students who don't have the refinement, if there is such a thing as refinement in Minnesota Nice, to deal with things. But otherwise, I think they're just not used to seeing people who have raggedy old cars because we're poor, people who don't have fancy clothes. Again, Minnesota doesn't dress up. That's kind of part of Minnesota Nice, I guess. They don't overly dress up. But ultimately, I think that, it can shock them just to see all the people. Just the simple numbers are kind of frightening in, the president's neighborhood more than anything else. Thank you. Is there anything else you want to elaborate on that, Susan?
I was going to say, I think the discourse is exactly the same now, the discourse of civility. If you raise your voice at the academic senate, you are uncivil. No, you're just assholes and you're wrong. And calling that out is seen as being uncivil. No, right. It's not uncivil. It's, it's challenging, sure. Mm-hmm. But if, the point of the academic senate, in places like that is to just be a rubber stamp on what administration was going to do anyway, well, then why are you there? And so I think, the whole civility discourse, has just gone, either from the streets into the academic senates, but I think it's still the same challenge. And as you pointed out, the challenge to critical race theory is a challenge to any kind of discussion about anybody that's not white and male.
Right.
And so, I don't think it's changed that much. And so but Minnesota Nice is a particular variant of it. And so, but it's good to see a lot of colleagues and students. And I see a lot of people who were invited to leave their graduate program along with me over the years if we were so unhappy. So it's good to see lots of folks on this call.
One thing I'd love to throw in, this is Robert Frank, is just the civility question. I'm so glad you asked it, but also just when you mentioned, like, if you yell at them because they're doing something stupid, like, that's different but just how what action gets defined as civil depending on who's saying it and what they look like is really just, I think, a key component of that. How many times are people told us, oh no, calm down, and they're speaking very calmly, or they're not. Yeah, so there's a piece of that can really get my goat.
Yeah, that's a good observation. Now, it's interesting. If we look at people discussing critical race theory, I haven't seen very many who are nice. They're not nice about it.
No.
They're not nice about it at all. They're bullies and thugs, and they couldn't converse if they wanted. If we disagree with each other, okay, here's your position, here's mine, and we figure things out. But that is a little different when we're under the gun. Okay.
So I wonder if I could ask Gabriella Spears, who put a great comment in the chat about what's happening at the U in terms of workers and the struggle that workers in Teamsters 320 are currently experiencing. So the U is an employer as well as a site of knowledge production or pretending that knowledge is being produced, but it's also an employer. And I think it gives us a chance to look at some of the intersections between specific identities like Chicano identity and class and labor. So Gabriella, I'm going to risk calling on you. You haven't volunteered to speak, but would you say a little bit about what's going on?
Yes, I will share the limited information that I've gotten so far from talking to their union rep. His name is Jackson, and I met him last week. Last week we had our faculty retreats. Just to introduce myself before that, I'm Gabriella Spears Rico, and I'm an assistant professor at the U. I purposefully and passionately selected Chicano Latino Studies as my tenure home when I was hired, because I did have a choice, and that was my choice, seeing how the department had been so underfunded and under-resourced by the university, and I wanted to be part of that vision going forward. And then I'm also jointly appointed in American Indian Studies. So I actually met the union rep at our American Indian Studies faculty retreat. There's a new colleague that we have in AIS who's actually a very fierce organizer named Nick Estes, who connected with the campus workers pretty much upon his arrival and wanted to know what was going on. So right now, the Teamsters Union is in negotiations with the university. From the information I got from Jackson, they've been negotiating since May, and it has not been going well. It's been going, pretty harshly for the workers. They're asking for, they're getting paid right now $15 an hour, which unfortunately is not a living wage. Here in Minnesota right now, there are workers that are going hungry. There are workers that are also struggling with housing issues. We met two of the workers who came to that meeting. There was one worker who was a Somalian janitor, and another worker who was a dining hall worker, who's actually part of one of the Sisseton tribes. And so these are definitely folks of color, indigenous folks, who are doing this type of labor. And I identify with it because my mother was a farm worker for a long time, and then got really happy and excited when she got her benefits union job as a university janitor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo. So I invited them also to our Chicano Latino Studies faculty retreat, and we got to hear a little bit from Jackson then. as to concrete actions that we can take. So they're developing letters, that are going to be sent out to the university administration about the abhorrent negotiations that are happening right now. Like, for example, they talked about how they're also hiring workers with an app. So they're replacing workers by having an app and hiring non-union laborers that are coming in at the last minute and paying them more than folks who have been there for 20 plus years at the university and who are unionized. So there's these types of bad faith deals that are happening, and that's the awareness that the union wants to bring to us as faculty, so that we can support their struggle as laborers at the university as well, and make our voices heard. And our ethnic studies department so far, they've talked to American Indian Studies, African American Studies, and us, CLS. We've been supportive because we come from these movimientos that you all are helping us understand and historicizing. And, it would be highly hypocritical of our fields to not to stand in solidarity with the workers. So we're learning more. We've also, they want to come speak to our classes, so that's another possibility as well. And I'm not sure exactly how they're mobilizing the community beyond having folks coming to pickets, which I know that they already had one in late August, but right. I'm definitely going to stay attuned to, more actions that are coming up. And I will, for folks that are connected with me in social media, I can also drop my email on the chat if you want to, let me know, and I can share whatever, information I get from here on out. And I apologize for not being on camera. I spent the entire day at the hospital today, and I'm just really frazzled supporting my family who unfortunately are facing various health issues. So yeah, but it's nice to chime in and talk to everybody and hear this talk. And thank you so much for the history that was shared today. It helps ground us in the department.
Glad to meet you by voice.
Thank you very much, Gabriela. And so while I'm calling on people, Marco Cruz, you put some things in the chat about what's going on with the Minnesota nurses. You want to say a little bit about that?
Absolutely, yes. Thank you. First and foremost, I want to be grateful and acknowledge my professors, the folks that have informed a lot of my activism or unionism nowadays. Jim Patino, really appreciate you, brother. Yes, so we have a huge strike, historical actually. It will be the first one in U.S. history for nurses. 15,000 of them will be striking. And it's really exciting because not only that they're setting a precedent, but because it's going to be popular. I was thinking popular, right? Like it's going to pop off, and unions nowadays are becoming normalized. And I think that's great. That's normal, right? We get to talk about it. So in that regard, yes, I'm very excited. I do work for the Minnesota Nurses Association. I am an alumni of Chicano Studies from the University of Minnesota. I don't know. I think we have a lot of great magic coming up. So I hope you all can partake. And I'll drop my email and whatever you all need.
Thank you.
So we can connect. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's interesting, Dionicio, to see in some ways history repeating itself in these kinds of connections, and how a space like Chicano Latino Studies or African American and African Studies or American Indian Studies can all be spaces where critical thinking is produced and solidarity is produced. And I'm hopeful that people will go to the picket lines of the nurses and see them as a learning environment. What do you learn on a picket line? The various ways that people treat you, the issues that are discussed. So it's great that Dionicio, that you've brought this group together tonight that brings these different threads together and suggests Chicano Studies is very much a living project, not just something to appreciate as part of history. Are there other comments, questions? There's such a great group of people here. Brother Moreno, you show your face. Are you interested in speaking?
Yes, I wanted to thank Dionicio for reminding all of us that without community and students, we wouldn't have these programs and departments, and we wouldn't be working on these campuses. And so every time I get the opportunity to remind my colleagues, my students that, the reason we're here is because of those students, especially where I'm currently in Bowling Green, Ohio. And I remind them that, the BSU and Latino students, Black students in the 70s, we wouldn't have these courses. But I also remind them that we're being attacked 24/7. So it's important to, understand contemporary issues going on, but again, historical too. So thank you, Dionicio, for reminding us about these struggles, and these struggles are very important, and how much community plays in developing these programs and keeping these programs alive and defending us.
Great to hear from you.
Thank you. The wonders of Zoom. We have a brother from Bowling Green in the midst of the conversation tonight. Excellent. Someone else, thoughts, questions, testimonies, picket lines to invite us to. What else? I will mention that the Eastside Freedom Library is hosting a labor solidarity picnic this Saturday from 3 to 6. The young man that was invoked as part of the Teamsters at the U, Jackson Kerr. Jackson will speak at the picnic. People from the Nurses Union will be speaking. SEIU Healthcare. There are several hospitals, including M Health Fairview, where the mental health workers are also have taken a strike vote and may be hitting the picket lines very soon. We'll also be hearing from Starbucks and Amazon workers. So it's an exciting moment of, to use that academic word, intersectionality that's going on. Join us at the Eastside Freedom Library unless you're in Bowling Green. Come and have a hot dog or a hamburger or an ear of corn. Someone else, questions for Dionicio or comments, please.
Thank you all for being here. We'll hope to see you at another upcoming program. And for a few last words, Peter?
Well, I do want to encourage everyone to join us next week with Katie Phillips, who has just written a children's book about Indigenous Peoples Day. And she will be talking about, so we haven't talked much about getting the message out to even younger learners. And Katie has written this great children's book, and she'll be talking about that on the 15th, next Thursday, 7 o'clock Zoom format. We're also opening an exhibit at the Eastside Freedom Library called Faces of Solidarity. And this is a photography exhibit. All the untold stories, all the things we don't know. Who knew that there were 15 Polish labor activists who, after the Solidarity movement was suppressed in Poland in the early 1980s, immigrated to Minnesota. And two Polish activists have found them, collected their oral histories, taken gorgeous headshots, photographs of them. And we're going to have the exhibit up for a month. We want to really use the exhibit as a mirror for people in the Oromo, Eritrean, Mexican, Salvadoran, Hmong, Karen communities to come and talk about what led them to emigrate, to leave where they had grown up, what led them to immigrate to Minnesota, and what traumas have they experienced on both ends of those processes. So in a way, to go back to Dionisio's comments about trying to get Rudy Vicoli, who was also someone that I looked up to get Rudy to consider a broader scope for immigration scholarship and recognition. We're trying to promote those conversations across very different experiences. And who thinks of Polish labor immigrants to Minnesota in the late 1980s? And what other stories do we still not even know? Because there hasn't been a language or media or some scholar to call it to our attention. So come hang out with us at the Eastside Freedom Library and discover new things.